Hello and welcome to another post azoffroad trip video. I'm Scotty and today I will be talking about my most recent adventure, which just wrapped up on our channel, which of course was the White Mountain Special. It was my 6-day, 600-mile off-road journey through eastern Arizona, which featured just some incredible and amazing scenery, trails, and stops along the way. If you have not seen it yet, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I would highly recommend clicking on the box now that is appearing above my head. That will take you to part 104 of the series. For those of you that have already seen it, I do thank you for watching it. Thank you for commenting on it. Got some really great feedback on this one, and I do sincerely appreciate it. With that being said, the point of today's video is going to be to dive a little bit deeper into that trip. Oftentimes in the main video series, I don't have the time I want to stop and talk about every single topic. And a space like this is perfect because it allows me to go a little bit deeper, spend a little bit more time, and hopefully answer any questions that you may have about the trip or about how I do my trips. Now, on the bottom of your screen right now, you are able to see the topics that I will be covering today. Of course, if I don't get to your question or you have some other comments or input, feel free to chime in down below in the comments and I will get back to you as soon as I can. With that being said, let's dive right into the first topic. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover today is the idea of doing a solo trip. Whether it's camping solo, going off-roading solo, doing a trip by yourself definitely has some differing opinions. So I want to run through some of the pros and cons and my thought process on why I do it. One of the big issues with a solo trip is that you are solely responsible for everything. Not only do you plan the trip, but you also drive the trip, you navigate, you set up camp, prepare all the food, do all the dishes, clean up camp, and in my case, I also film a little bit. So that is a lot of tasks that you are now responsible for. All of that takes up time in the day and can add some stress to your trip. So that is definitely something you have to realistically look at. Are you able to handle doing all that by yourself? And also on that too, is how can you simplify those things to make them easier? Now, another big disadvantage of doing a solo trip is what if something happens to you? If there's a medical issue or there's another issue, how are you gonna take care of yourself? When you go with someone else, it's easy, you have another person to rely on, but when it's just you, you have to be prepared for anything. And that's where we'll get into some tips in a little bit, such as carrying a GPS and extra gear. But we'll cover that in just a minute. Now, there are several advantages to doing a solo trip as well. And in my opinion, one of the biggest is that you get to do what you want when you want to. Now, that means you can stop and take as many pictures as you want. You can have lunch wherever you want. You can explore side trails. You have the freedom to do what you want. You're not limited by other people's time frames. You're able to just kind of go with the flow and do what you want to do. Another big plus is that you get some quiet time. You get some time to enjoy nature, whether that's hiking or camping or four-wheeling. You get to just be out there and be by yourself, have some time to think, whatever it may be. And that can be a very rewarding experience for some people, or that might be a very scary thought for others. Now, some tips that I would definitely recommend if you are considering doing a solo trip. Number one is to carry some kind of two-way communicator. I feel like you cannot do a solo trip without this. Now, that can be a spot device, that can be a Garmin device, that can be a personal locator beacon, but have something that allows you to communicate with the outside world that isn't a cell phone. And I say that because on this trip in particular, after day 2, when I reached Crescent Lake, there was essentially no coverage anywhere on the trip. The only time I got a teeny bit of coverage was at the very top of the fire tower at PS Knoll. I think I got one text message out. You don't want to be stuck relying on a cell phone, and that is where the two-way communicator comes in. Now, personally, I use a Garmin InReach device. Now, this is not a sponsorship or endorsement by any means. It's just what I have chosen to use, and I have found it very reliable. The big plus of having something like this is you are able to text people, you're able to give updates, and likewise, if you do have an emergency or medical issue, you're able to reach out very quickly. You can hit the SOS button and help will be on the way. It's a very comforting feeling to know, not only for yourself, but for any family and friends you have back home that are maybe skeptical of you going out by yourself. Now, throughout my trip, I use my Garmin a lot. Every day, a couple times a day, I'd be texting back home saying, hey, I'm on the trail, doing great. And then every night when I camped, I would say that I'm stopped for the night. And then I would send my coordinates to whoever it was I was talking to. And that way they knew exactly where I was, which is really nice to know. Now also too, you can use it for navigating, and you can also use it to get weather updates. So that is definitely a huge requirement if you're going to go out by yourself. You need to carry something that allows you to communicate. And whatever you choose, that's up to you. They have different advantages with each device and different costs associated as well. Now, my second big piece of advice when you're doing a solo trip is to dial it back a little bit. Be extra cautious, be overly prepared, and kind of go a little bit slower. Assess any situations you're in and make a good judgment call. Now, when you're doing a group trip, obviously you have other vehicles there. You can do other things because if you get stuck or you break down, you can have someone pull you out, you can get towed out. It's very simple and there's not much of a concern there. Now, when me and my cousin do our trips together, just having another person there is also nice because I know that I can do some things that I normally wouldn't on a solo trip. And the big thing on a solo trip is to not take any unnecessary risks. So don't try that difficult trail. Don't, push yourself too hard, because at the end of the day, you are responsible for yourself. And that is where on this solo trip and other trips I do, I'm always extra cautious. I'm not doing extremely difficult stuff just because I'm out by myself and I don't want to put myself in a situation that quickly can turn bad. Now, my third and final point about doing a solo trip is to make an itinerary and also share that with family and friends. That way they know where you're at, what you're planning on doing. Now, in my case, every big trip that I go on, I always make a very detailed itinerary, which you can see here. This document has a lot of information. It has my route plan, it has my meal plan, it has my packing list and supply list, and it also has some information about emergency situations. Now, this was about 15 pages of stuff that I compiled before the trip, and it's all part of the planning aspect where I'm creating the route and going through everything and picking out the stuff that I want to see. Now, when I give it to family, they're able to walk through this when I'm out on the trip and see that, oh, according to this, should be pretty close to this area. And the important thing is to stick to it. Obviously there's going to be some deviations in the trip, but it is important to make a plan and try your best to stick to it. That will be the best for you at the end of the day. Now, the second thing I want to talk about today is my campsites. So on this trip, I camped for 5 nights, and every single night was within national forest boundaries. The first night was in Tonto National Forest. The second night was at a primitive campground in the Apache-sitgreaves forest. And then the last 3 nights were dispersed camping throughout the Apache-sitgreaves forest as well. Now, all of my campsites are typically picked ahead of time. I spend a lot of time in Google Earth looking at different maps and trail books, and I determine at least a few different campsites each night I want to camp at. Now, almost every campsite I pick is pre-planned ahead of time. As part of my route planning and trip planning, I always pick out 1 to 2, maybe even 3 campsites each day, depending on where I'm at and what I'm doing on the trail. And for the most part, I was able to stick to that plan. Now, towards the end of the trip, I kind of changed it up a little bit. Obviously, the White Mountains are incredibly popular, especially in the summertime and on the weekends. So oftentimes I would come to a site that I had picked out and there were people there, or there were people close by. And that is where it was nice to just drive down the trail. I was able to find a few impromptu sites. In fact, the last 2 nights of my trip were completely unplanned. I just kind of happened upon those campsites, just driving down the road until I found something I liked. And that can work out too. When you're going to kind of a higher traffic area, you can almost guarantee that your site is going to be occupied. And that is the issue with dispersed camping, is you can't make reservations, you just have to show up. And on this trip where I was just going campsite to campsite, I wasn't in any one place for more than one night, just kind of make it work. And luckily in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest, there's plenty of land, there's plenty of trails to discover. And the last 2 nights of my trip, I just drove down the road, kind of did some exploring until I found a spot that I liked. And those spots ended up being really nice. The 4th night of the trip was in just this tiny little aspen grove. There was a nice little clearing there with a fire ring. And then the last night of my trip was a little bit more isolated. It was near this gorgeous meadow, and it was really nice to just spend the last night of the trip in such a beautiful spot, really. My advice for finding good campsites would just be to spend some time in Google Earth, and also spend some time on the trails, just kind of poking around, exploring. That is sometimes how you can find the best campsites. Now, the last big topic I want to cover is the tire change. So on day 3 of my trip, I got a flat tire, and I ended up having to change it later in the day down the trail. Now that was definitely a learning experience for me. It's one of those things where it was just bound to happen. You know, you can't help it. And I was on some more difficult trails that day, and coming down from the lookout, I just ended up with a leaking tire. Now my initial thought was to air it up and see how far I could get it, and just keep doing that until I got to my camp for the night, because I wanted to be able to set up camp and change the tire in the same spot. Now that didn't end up working, just because I got tired of airing it up. So I just changed it about midway through the day. That way I could keep doing some exploring and then also go back to a campsite later that day. And I didn't get to talk about this in the main video, but there were a couple of issues that did pop up that kind of slowed me down. So first thing I did when I changed the tire is I had to get all my gear out. So I got all the lug wrenches out, I got the spare tire off, I got the jack out and ready. And one of the big things I found was that my high lift jack, which is not actually a high lift, failed me. And I took it off. I was going to use it to get the Jeep up very quickly and easily, and I went to use it, and it was pretty weathered and not functioning like I wanted it to. So that was my first big problem of the tire change, was I had to resort to my backup jack, which is actually the factory one that comes with my Jeep, and I was able to use that luckily. Secondly is the lug nuts. Now when I got my Jeep and I put the lift on, I put new wheels and tires on, I had bought a set of lug nuts for all 4 tires. And I also bought a lug wrench that fits those. I needed kind of a deeper socket to be able to access the lug nuts and turn them off the wheel. And a couple years later, when I decided to put my rear bumper on, I got a couple of new tires and I made a full-size spare with a matching wheel. Now for that, when I mounted it on the rear bumper, I used the lug nuts that came with the wheel. And I didn't think to check at the time if my socket would work. I just assumed that, okay, it's the same size, same tire, no big deal. Now I found out when I was trying to take it off that they were different sizes, and that was preventing me from getting my socket that I had bought 4 tire changes, prevented me from getting that on and turning it. So I was a little bit concerned at that point that I wouldn't be able to get the tire off, but luckily again, my backup saved me. The factory lug wrench that came with the Jeep, which is just this dinky little thing, was able to grab the lug nuts and twist them off. And that gets into a good point about going through your gear. Now, self-admittedly, that is one of my mistakes on this trip, is I didn't go through all my gear. I didn't make sure I had all the proper things I needed. And luckily, I had a couple of backup things that really helped save me out in the White Mountains. Now, I could have relied on someone else to pass by, but if I didn't have those things, I would have been in a pretty good bind. And that brings me to my point of going through your gear before a big trip and just making sure you have what you need. So one of the things that I'm personally going to be doing before my next trip is running through all my gear, making sure I have what I need, and having some extra stuff as well. I'm going to be taking a look at my jack, maybe lubing it up a little bit, making sure it's working. I'm going to make sure I have some extra sockets because I kind of carry the bare minimum of what I think I may need in a pinch. That includes, extra fluids. I have a jump box for my battery, tow strap, battery cables, small things that I would need to make a small repair and just keep me going on the trip. And one of the things that I could do in the future is carry some extra gear, extra tools, different size sockets, different wrenches. That way, if I do have a more serious problem, I can at least maybe make it work with what I have. At the end of the day, it was still a fun experience. It was still a learning lesson. And it's one of those things where you just, get it done on the trail and make adjustments for the next trip. So wanted to talk about that a little more in detail here. That way you guys could get the full story and get some advice and some tips on what I'm going to be doing the next time I go on a big trip. Well, that is about all I can think of for this trip. It was a great experience, really fun trip that I thoroughly enjoyed doing. If you have any more questions from stuff that I didn't cover in today's video or the other videos, feel free to drop a comment again on this video and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you for watching this video. I do appreciate you watching this as well as the whole series. I do look forward to making more AZ Off-Road specials in the future. Yes, Daniel will be back on future specials, and as well as our other videos, normal trips and Jeep upgrades, which are all upcoming in the future. Be taking a couple week break just to kind of regroup and go through some gear, but I do look forward to returning back to our normal content. But as always, thank you for watching this one, and we'll see you on the next one.